Thank you. Thank you. And, you know, I wanted to talk, we talked about the rise of the United States to being a world power, and that's great. It's another thing to perpetuate that economic power. That gets us into the 1900s. And in looking at the 1900s, in studying it, I mean, this is someone who is an economic historian. And I looked and I noticed, you know, one of the things you see as you look through American history is that we have one of the most prosperous decades in U.S. history, the 1920s, followed by the most economically disastrous decade in U.S. history, the 1930s, the Great Depression. So you have in that century a decade, the 1920s, in which gross national product increased 25%. That's the equivalent of like adding to the nation in a 10-year period, Texas, California, and some of Florida. I mean, just all of those cities, Houston, Los Angeles, everything. It's as though in 10 years, all of that is created. That's how good the 1920s were. The 1930s, we went downhill. And so you think, well, what's going on here? See, the question we ought to be thinking of is, what did we do in the 20s that worked? And then apparently we stopped doing it and we did something else in the 30s. So what was that we were doing in the 30s? And what was that we were doing in the 20s? And if we study that and figure it out, then we can obviously try to apply the 20s formula to current politics and kind of forget maybe the 30s. But let's see what happened. And so, you know, this got me to do a lot of studying on both decades. Now, we start in the 1920s, and I have to say this, it started terribly. You know, you think, well, this is the prosperous decade. It started horribly because World War I had ended. And the aftermath of the war, we had 4 million soldiers come home. They couldn't find jobs. In 1920 and 21, we had 12% unemployment, more than today. The national debt to pay for World War I was so huge. Let me just describe it. Before the World War I, our whole gross national product debt, I'll put a B here for billion, 1 billion national debt before World War I. $1 billion. After World War I, it's this. Now, you look at today, people say, well, today is rough. It is, but this is a 24 times increase in a period of 4 years. And we had all that unemployment. We had high tax rates that were going on because people said we needed them to raise money to get rid of the debt. That was then discouraging entrepreneurship. It was a disaster. The 1920 election is going to be an important one. By the way, you know, your high school students, some of you in AP history, who are our presidents of the 1920s? Yeah, you know.
Warren G. Harding.
Warren G. Harding? Coolidge. Warren G. Harding, right, and Calvin Coolidge. Right at the end of the decade, we have Herbert Hoover. But it's mainly Harding and Coolidge. And Harding, as many of you know, died in office, and Coolidge was his vice president. So Coolidge became president, and then Coolidge was elected in 1924. So Harding's elected. The Harding-Coolidge ticket was elected in 1920. Then Coolidge was elected in 24, and they serve until early 1929. So they're in for quite a while, Harding and Coolidge. And they both think a lot alike, so the policies were very similar with both of them. Now, Harding got in, and he campaigned. Now, this is interesting for politics. We like boldness at Young America's Foundation. But wisdom says there is a time sometimes not to be so bold. And then there's a time to be bold. And Harding and Coolidge were practicing, or learning that and practicing it. For example, during the 1920 campaign, when reporters went up to Harding and said, "What's your plan for the economy?" He thought, now is not the time to be bold. And he said, I definitely am going to have a change, and I'm going to have a committee look into it. We're going to appoint people from all parts of life to look into the economy. And that's not very bold. When he got in, this committee was looking into the economy, and they came up with a recommendation. The debt has increased from $1 billion to $24 billion. The tax rates are high. They're over 70% on top incomes. I mean, that's wild. And the committee came up with a recommendation, and they said, what President Harding and Vice President Coolidge, what you need to do is have a stimulus package. Now, they didn't use the word stimulus package, although they did use the word stimulant occasionally in their recommendation. That's more of a modern adaptation, the stimulus package, but that's what it was. They said we need a stimulant. We need to have government spending, and they suggested in particular roads, because the automobile had become a national institution by the early 20s. Most people were driving, and you always need better roads, so let's get the World War I veterans building the roads. We create jobs, they make money, and everything is going to go well. Now, it's interesting what Harding and Coolidge said. Coolidge, you know, was a man of few words. He said, no. And, you know, well, why? Now, a good explanation, and Coolidge and Harding gave it, but today, is a book, a guy who lived through the 1920s and 30s and learned from it. A man named Henry Hazlitt, Hazlitt, a book called Economics in One Lesson. Maybe some of you read it. Have a few of you? Yeah. It's a good beginner on economics. What the point he makes is this. You can never get out of economic depressions with stimulus packages because you're simply taking, it would be like taking from, say, our first 5 rows here, and we're going to tax all of you and give to those at the back of the room. That's great for those at the back of the room, but the money that they would be spending is taken from you people at the front of the row. So if you look at it from what they call an aggregate, from an overall picture, it doesn't generate any new money. It simply is those people at the back spending it instead of you people. So what we see are those people spending more money than they ever spent before, but that isn't what you got to look at. It's you people spending less. And so they said you can't ever actually resolve unemployment that way. And so Harding and Coolidge said no. And then the reporter said, well, is this the politics of no? And they said, no, we have a plan. Two pieces to the plan. Number one, cut federal spending, which is a reverse stimulus package, by the way. Cut federal spending and cut the tax rates to encourage entrepreneurs to invest, because now they'll get to keep most of what they make. Under Harding and Coolidge, in just a matter of 2 to 3 years, federal spending was cut in half. Some of this was leftover World War I expenses. Some of it was farm subsidies, which we had during World War I, which we dropped completely. We were cutting federal spending. We cut federal spending in half. And I think this is kind of an interesting historical episode. Because wouldn't the question be, okay, well, and by the way, we cut tax rates. The tax rate, which was over 70%, was going to be cut to 25% at the top. That's the top that anybody had to pay, was 25%. Harding and Coolidge brought in as Secretary of Treasury one of the wealthiest men in the world named Andrew Mellon. And I have a picture of him here in Myth of the Robber Barons. Such a kindly man. Oh, don't you like that mustache and all of this? Yeah. Kindly man. And he made a statement that some people just laughed at. Here was his statement. We quote it on the first page of the chapter in Myth of the Robber Barons. Mellon says this. They're talking about cutting the tax rate. Because people said, well, if you cut the tax rate, we won't be able to take in as much money. And if we don't take in as much money, the debt will increase. And here's what Mellon said. It seems difficult for some to understand that high rates of taxation do not necessarily bring large revenue to the government, and that more revenue may often be obtained by lower rates. In other words, if we cut the rates, we might actually increase everybody's income so much that will actually increase the revenue. In other words, if you have a 70% income tax, but you only have 3 millionaires in the whole country, you may not get as much as if you have, say, a 25% tax, but you have 10,000 millionaires in the country. And so he's saying you may actually make more money for the government if you cut the revenue, and it will make more money for the entrepreneurs because they'll get to keep most of what they invest. Harding and Coolidge both accepted the recommendations of Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon. As a result, the United States was on course we cut the 2/3 off of the tax rate at the top levels, from 73 to 25. We lowered the rates on everybody. At the bottom level, we lowered, the lowest rate was 4%. We cut that to 1/2 of 1%. And then we raised the exemption, which means that fewer people were even paying any income tax. We did all of that. I think it's interesting to ask, what is the American economy going to look like 2 years later, 2 or 3? See, in 1921, we have $1 billion, we go from $1 billion to $24 billion national debt. We have 12% unemployment. After 2 years of following Harding and Coolidge's policies, unemployment had gone from 12% to 2.4%. Wow, quick. People responded quickly to those tax cuts. 12%. And the revenue increased both years, 1921 and 1922, and it would continue because we followed these policies throughout the decade. The revenue exceeded the spending. The federal revenue, it was like the old days back in the 1830s when we were canceling the national debt entirely. We canceled 1/3 of the national debt out during that decade, so that by the end of the decade, the $24 billion is $16 billion. We cut 1/3, and we had budget surpluses every year of the 1920s. The last decade in U.S. history that we had revenue exceeding spending every year, a surplus every year of the decade. We got unemployment down to 2.4%. It ended up under Coolidge's term being an average of 3%. Very rarely does unemployment ever get down to 3% in this country. Under Coolidge, that's what the average was. Technically, it was 3.3% over the 6 years he was president. The 2 years from Harding's term and the 1 of his own. The lowest rate of any president since we've been keeping records on the subject. I would say that the policy of cutting tax rates and freeing up the economy and then cutting the national debt was extremely successful. It attracted investments all over the world again, and the United States economy boomed. Just to illustrate some specifics of the good things that happened, I wanted to mention a few. Some of these you know, like radio was invented, 1920s, and became household possession by the end of the decade. Refrigerators. Your great-grandparents, or maybe it's even great-great at this point back then, relied, because it's only, what, 90 years ago, they relied on the Iceman with a big chunk of ice. Would come up to your house and you had what's called an ice box. They'd put the chunk in the ice box. If it was a level chunk, you could put food on it. And it would keep that area cool, so your milk and your butter and whatever could keep cool. Then the ice would melt, and then a couple days later, the Iceman would come with another chunk of ice. You would empty the tray. It would melt. You had a tray to catch the water at the bottom. You dump the tray. The Iceman would put another chunk of ice in your ice box, and then that would be the way you would keep your food cool. Well, the refrigerator, can you see how people would like that? Well, you don't have to have, some people always said it's cruel. It put the Iceman out of business. Well, it also created jobs incredibly, making, advertising, and selling refrigerators. A new business that created help in the American economy and made life easier for Americans during the 1920s. Because we told entrepreneurs, you get to keep most of what you make. You're going to keep most of it. You invent it, you get to keep it. People had more leisure because they had more money, and therefore baseball becomes America's national pastime. Yeah, Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs at that time.
Incoming mail.
And we had big stadiums being built because baseball, people could go to games because they had more money to spend. They had more money to spend because there were more jobs. Wealth was increasing, and you could spend more of it on leisure. We have a series of inventions. A lot of these are exciting. Not so much for Santa Barbara, but for other areas like the American South, air conditioning. It was technically invented before the 20s, but it was never adapted seriously until after that. Willis Carrier was the inventor of air conditioning. He was a Yankee. I mean, you'd think he'd be some Southerner who was just boiling in sweat. He's up there in New York. He's an engineer at Cornell University. And somebody hired him to dehumidify a room because they were producing, if I borrow your folder here a minute, they're producing paper products, newspapers and printed bulletins. And they would print, and they noticed that when you printed a product and then the paper touched, the ink would sometimes smear. And they said, what we need to do is dehumidify the room, then the ink will dry quicker and we won't smear the paper and our business will be benefited. Carrier noticed when he was playing around and dehumidifying a room that he created a cooling effect. And he thought the implications of this, I wonder if this could be used to create a cooling effect in what we call today air conditioning. He couldn't experiment with it because the tax rates were 70%. Why should I take a risk doing this when it might flop and I'll lose everything? And if it succeeds, I give 2/3 of the money to the government. But the tax rates go down to 25%, and Carrier was in business, and we had a movie theater in New York, the Rivoli Theater in Manhattan, that bought the first air conditioning unit. It was one of these huge contraptions. It weighed many tons, much heavier than today. But it worked. People attending the movies, they found they had record attendance under air conditioning. In fact, they had their first exit polls because they thought, well, maybe the good attendance is because we're showing better movies. And so they interviewed people who came out of the movies and said, well, these are exit polls. They started out with they thought, well, what we really want to know is the impact of the air conditioning, but we won't just ask them that. We'll start out, did you like the movie? Why did you like the movie? Did you like your chair? Did you like your environment? You know what I mean? And they'd get toward it. So they start out, did you like the movie? And the guy says, what movie? I'm here to get out of the street. It's hot out there. It's cool in here. Well, it wasn't. By the end of the 1920s, 300 air-conditioned theaters existed in the United States. And of course, then it will go to factories. By the 1960s, you get home units. It'd be good to ask your grandparents when they got air conditioning. Now, some of you from California, the answer may be never, right? But I mean, those from warmer climates, in my case, 1962. And that's common. Right around there in the 60s is when home air conditioning units became cheap enough that we got them. But it starts out with large units. It goes movie theaters, factories, and then works its way down to where it gets profitable for home units to have. So air conditioning is an invention of the 1920s. Talking movies. Yeah. And that goes well with the air conditioning, doesn't it? You can get more people who are having a better time in the movie theater. Talking movies, 1927. Warner Brothers and others, MGM, they take the risks with talking movies because they get to keep most of what they earn. It's an innovative decade, the 1920s. I have to mention one final invention. Hookless #2. Hookless number 2, invented by a Swedish immigrant, Gideon Sundback. Hookless number 2. Yeah, I heard somebody say it. What do we know it as today? The zipper. The zipper. We use buttons to hold clothes together. In fact, when Gideon Sundback took his hookless number 2 to the patent office, they were putting it up and down, and the patent guy said, "We are generous in the way we give patents." He said, "So I'm going to give you a patent for this. I can't imagine a use for it." He said he cannot imagine a use for it because it takes that kind of imagination. In fact, see, that's what liberty is often about. We give people freedom. They produce products like, how many of you, I wonder, most of your parents, 15 years ago said, "What would you like somebody to invent?" And they pop out, "Well, let me see what I think. Oh, I'll tell you what I'd like. I'd like an iPhone. Because then I could take pictures and I could text online, I could get some music and all." You know, they don't, because it takes somebody, the same thing with the zipper. Nobody says, "Well, what would you like to have invented?" No, nobody say, "Well, the zipper." I mean, they can't imagine it. It takes somebody to invent it, and then the application of the invention, and then you have something that is so powerful it affects everybody's life. And then 10 years later, you can't imagine life without it. See, now, if you would have asked Calvin Coolidge and Warren Harding at the time that they were saying no to the stimulus package, "Oh, no, we need that, you ought to have a stimulus package." And they'd say, "No, because I think Gideon Sundback's going to invent a zipper, and we need it. And besides, I want to have some talking movies. All those silent movies bore me. I want talking movies. Somebody will invent them. And besides, it's hot around here in Washington, D.C. in the summer. We need some air conditioning." You don't know that they're going to invent those things. That's the exciting thing in many ways about freedom and liberty. You turn people loose, and what they produce changes the world, because a lot of times you can't imagine what it is they're going to invent, and they're products you didn't even know that you wanted. I didn't know 10 or 15 years ago I wanted an iPhone. Now I can't even go 1 hour without, "Oh, where is it? Here. Yeah. And I didn't even know I wanted one 10 years ago. People were that way about zippers and talking movies and even air conditioning. A lot of people didn't know it was possible to invent such things. It would not have been possible if we had the tax rate up there so high that we wouldn't have given people the incentive to invest and say, "You're going to get to keep most of what you make." In the 1920s we did, and that's how we create the state of Texas and California, the equivalent, in a 10-year period, expanding economic growth in this country, which almost raises the impression, what went wrong? You have everything going so nicely. The answer is the Republican Party, then as now, is divided into 2 parts. They have the free market wing and more of the moderate big government wing. The person who was elected in 1928, Herbert Hoover, was one of the ones who was sympathetic to a stimulus package idea. Hoover came in and immediately began promoting bigger government. For example, we passed the highest tariff in U.S. history. Some of you may have heard of it. It is called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. Named after a senator and a congressman. The senator, Smoot, was a senator from Utah, and what he wanted was a high tariff on sugar because Utah was a beet sugar state. And he wanted to stop imported sugar. See, these were high tariffs. We had a high tariff on Swiss watches. Swiss watches were the best in the world. This is back in the days when you had to wind your watch. Swiss watches were the best. The American watches, they weren't as good, and they cost more. The Swiss watches were about $1.50, and the United States watches were about $3. And you'd wind the American watch, and it would run the minute in 58 seconds. And the Swiss watch would keep perfect time. So most Americans, especially since the Swiss watches were cheaper, they bought Switzerland watches. Those watchmakers were concentrated in Connecticut and Rhode Island, and then they said, "Boy, it'd be nice if we could sell our watches," so we got a tariff of over $2 a watch on the Swiss watches, which meant that if you bought one, they'd be more expensive than the American watches. because of the tax that was being put on them. And so more Americans started buying American watches. They didn't keep as good a time, but you saved some money. The Swiss were furious. And that's the point with the Great Depression here. The Swiss said, and it wasn't just the Swiss, but because we were doing this with lots of products overseas, the British, we put a tax on their wool blankets, we took a tax on Spanish olives and so on across the board. And so most of the European countries said, if the Americans won't buy our stuff, we won't buy their stuff. So they refused to buy American cars. We sold 5 million American cars in 1929. We only sold 1.6 million in 1932. A lot of that is the decline in the foreign market. Now here's my point. The tariff had disastrous negative consequences. It's a government program. We also had, Milton Friedman made this point, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates. That made money harder to borrow, so it was harder to start a business. Then Hoover increased the tax rate from 25% at the top level to 63% at the top level. By the time he left office, unemployment had gone from 2% when he came in to 25%. Franklin Roosevelt came in saying that Hoover had a big spending administration and he didn't like it. But once Roosevelt got in, he was Hoover on steroids. The spending, you know, when I wrote the book New Deal or Raw Deal, because I thought it's important to look at this episode in history, I thought, how do you begin a book like this? Because Roosevelt, he had so many federal programs, you know, many of them, the TVA, the CCC. I'm going to talk about a couple of them, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the WPA. How many have heard of the WPA? Do some of you maybe even have, that you know of, a great-grandparent or something who worked on the WPA? You might check. Some of you might have that because they employed a lot of people in the 30s. It's a government program. But these government programs totally failed. Unemployment was at double digits throughout the 1930s. All of this massive federal spending that Roosevelt undertook did not get us out. And I decided to begin the book with the quotation from his Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau. This is his own Secretary of Treasury who was a good friend of his. They were personal buddies. And Henry Morgenthau said this. This quotation is from his diary in the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York. He said this: "We have tried spending money." By the way, when he said this, it was in 1939 at the end of 2 terms of Roosevelt, and unemployment hit was 20.7%. It had fluctuated. It got down to 15 and then up to 20 and down to 17, and now it's back up at 20. "We have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. And I have just one interest, and if I'm wrong, somebody else can have my job. I want to see this country prosperous. I want to see people get a job. I want to see people get enough to eat. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot. We doubled the national debt from 20 billion to 40 billion.
Wait, so we doubled 24 instead of 16.
It went from 16 to 20 under Hoover, and then 20 to 40 in the first 2 terms of Roosevelt. See? Yeah. We doubled the national debt, all the while with all this massive stimulus package material. It remained 15 and sometimes over 20%. 8 years into this almost, it was still 20% unemployment. All of that spending, and the reason, it's back to Henry Hazlitt and what we talked about with Harding and Coolidge. You can't take tax revenue from one group of you, give it to the other, and actually create net jobs. This group does benefit, But they benefit at the expense of this group, so overall, you never create anything. Plus, you're creating a huge government bureaucracy. And you're raising the tax rate so that entrepreneurs have less incentive to invent products because they don't get to keep most of what they earn. So they back off and they don't try. Thus, the Great Depression. When we had private enterprise dominant in the 20s, we prospered, we go to government programs, we go into debt. Now, some of this, it may seem just obvious, but it's good to just go over it just a little bit quickly. I mean, you had like a piece of land here. Let's say it's a half section of land, 320 acres. Under Roosevelt's program, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, he said, he had a wild proposal. It was so exciting, it could only have been dreamed up by a college professor. And it was a Harvard University economist, Professor Black, came up with this idea. He said, look, let's have the farmers pay them not to produce on part of their land. They'll take some of their land out of circulation and they won't produce on it, and we'll pay them not to produce on it. And therefore, we won't have overproduction because a quarter of their land is out of circulation, and they'll have an incentive and they'll gain wealth because they're being paid. Yes?
Is this like from the book Catch-22? He gets paid not to produce whatever, I forget the exact, and then he just buys more land with it and he gets paid more money to not produce.
Yes. Now, I haven't read that part, but what you've described is what's happening here. You then take it and you buy more land, and you can then have more, be paid not to produce on more land. Yes, sir?
Was this just don't produce at all on that part of the land, or was it used for, because sometimes the farmers overwork the land, which causes
Yeah.
oil and Oklahoma. Was this just to provide a little land for circulation, or was it just don't produce on that piece of land at all?
Yeah, the question is, why are they told, is there any motive like restoring the soil or anything? That actually came into it later, but not at the beginning. At the beginning, it was just you didn't have to plant. Now, it did have the advantage of letting the land lie fallow, but which would restore the nutrients a little bit to the soil. But one thing we found was that, and Roosevelt was all excited over this program until he found some farmers, he was all satisfied in Washington, D.C., and somebody told him, some farmers are planting on this land anyway. They're being paid not to produce on it, and they're planting anyway. And so he said, aha, I have a solution. We'll pay inspectors to come on the land and check to make sure they don't produce. And we'll have them with equipment, and they'll measure everything, and we'll make sure they do not produce on this land. Then Roosevelt leaned back, and he was all happy. He had such a good program. Yes?
Isn't surplus good for the economy?
Surplus? Well, the surplus, say wheat and corn, reduced the price of wheat and corn, and so the farmers were getting less for their crop. The idea here is, if you produce only 3/4 wheat and corn, that will reduce the overall crop and you'll get more money. That's the theory. And then you'll get paid not to produce as well. Naturally, the farmers kind of liked this. But by the way, what's going to happen to the tax rates? Yeah, they're going to go up to 79% on top incomes. Then later, they're going to go to 90%. Then they're going to go to 94% on all income over $200,000. That means if you earn $300,000, if you're an entrepreneur, this is hitting the entrepreneur class. If you earn $300,000 a year on that last $100,000, you get to keep 6, and you send 94 to Washington. But Roosevelt felt we have to have money for the inspectors. Then he heard dramatic news that some of the farmers were using the money they were being paid not to produce to pay the inspectors to look the other way while they produced on that land anyway. So Roosevelt had inspectors to inspect the inspectors. The inspectors to inspect the inspectors. Then he heard that both sets of inspectors were being bribed, and so he bought a fleet of airplanes to go around the country and take pictures of everybody's land. Yeah. This is why the Ag Department was the biggest department in the federal budget except for the Defense Department. It was huge. You know, I sometimes thought, on my first job teaching, I was teaching at a southern school, and the chairman of the tenure committee was this old man, and we were going to go to a conference together. I had the chance, and I took it because I wasn't even sure if he knew who I was, and I wanted to get tenure. And so I thought I'd go on the conference and we'd talk, and he was an old Southern gentleman. He says, "Well, tell me about yourself, Folsom." You know, and I talked for a while, and then I asked him, and he said, "Well, back when I was in college, I worked one summer for the AAA." And it just shocked me so much, without thinking, I just said, "Did you take any bribes?" I don't know if he wondered whether this was a tenure. You know, I'm up for tenure pretty soon if that was an indication of my desires. It wasn't. It was just first. And by the way, he responded, "No, I didn't. The best offer I had was a set of tires. The good money, the wealth was all in the other end of the county, and my friends were getting it, and I got nothing." So it was a bad experience for him. But this was the AAA and the way it worked. Now, another program that can you see why this isn't going to get you out of a Great Depression? Yeah. I mean, that's part of it. This is not going to get anybody. It's going to increase the size of the federal government, but it's not going to get us out of the Great Depression. The other project that Roosevelt had was the WPA that I wanted to emphasize. Works Progress Administration, WPA. And the WPA is interesting because they build roads. This was the rejected program that Harding and Coolidge rejected. Now it's coming in a big way under Roosevelt. And of course we need roads. But with this, you have all sorts of people building roads, some of whom are competent to build the roads and some aren't, because it's all political. Let me quote, I thought in the book, maybe the best thing to do was just quote some of the people who are involved in the road building and see what you think they said, what of their comments. V.G. Copeland, the Democratic County Chairman of Indiana, said this, quote, "What I think will help is to change the WPA management from top to bottom, put men in there who are in favor of using these Democratic projects to make votes for the Democratic Party." I'll call on you in just a minute. I want to hear what you have to say. Let me give this other quote. James Doherty, a New Hampshire Democrat, agreed. He said, "It is my personal belief that to the victor belong the spoils, and the Democrats should be holding most of these WPA positions so that we might strengthen our fences for the 1940 elections." We give these jobs to Democrats, and everybody will then be inclined to say, "Hey, we better vote for the Democrats and maybe we can get a WPA job." Yes, sir. Good question. He's saying, who can answer him? Where did we get the money? Taxes. That's where the rate is going from 63 to 79 to 94. Because Roosevelt is saying the rich are not paying their fair share and they need to support the WPA. And so those taxes are coming. However, he ran out of money because the rich you run out of after a while. Then Roosevelt ultimately ended up favoring and got a 24% tax on everybody who had an income of more than $500 a year. In other words, the 25% under Coolidge was the top rate. Under Roosevelt, it's the bottom rate. But can you see all the money that's going to come in with 25% on everybody? That's when the money comes in. And so you can see it. He's getting money, and then he's doling it out to groups. The WPA money in key states. It was key states. For example, New Jersey was an important state. Let me give you a quote here from that. First of all, the WPA director in Jersey City, New Jersey, he's the director of the WPA. He always answered his telephone this way: Democratic headquarters. So in other words, the WPA director answers his phone, Democratic headquarters. You know what you better be able to offer him to get some WPA job. A lot of people on the WPA would campaign for the Democratic candidates. That would be what they do on their job at election time. Instead of building the road, they'd campaign. Congressman Frank Towie of New Jersey said this: in this county, there are 18,000 people on the WPA. With an average of 3 people in a family, you have 54,000 potential Democratic votes. Can anyone beat that if it is properly organized? In other words, we have a federal program. We'll make the Democrat, people want to vote Democrat to keep these programs going. The rich will pay for these programs. Yes, they will probably vote Republican. There aren't enough of them to make a difference. When we make the bottom people vote 24%, pay 24% in taxes, we'll tell them that they are having to pay so much because the rich aren't paying their fair share. The Roosevelt formula was very successful, and the Roosevelt formula was able to prevail until the end of World War II. And at that point, it fell apart. I want to give you one last story, and I'll open it up for questions. Senator Thomas Gore of Oklahoma was a Democrat who opposed the WPA. He had the nerve to oppose the WPA. He was a senior. Oklahoma became a state in 1907, and he was their first senator. And this is 1936. He's running for re-election. And he's running against the WPA. He says, I don't support it. The people in Thomas Gore's district came up to him and said, oh yeah? If you don't support the WPA, we won't support you. And they sent him a telegram to that effect. Gore made an initial statement when he said, no depression can be ended by gifts, gratuities, doles, and alms backed by the federal treasury and extorted from taxpayers who are bleeding at every pore. Roosevelt opposed Gore even though he was a Democrat. And when Gore ran for re-election, he came in 4th place out of 4 candidates. He was tossed out of office. Roosevelt not only beat Gore, he won carrying every state in the Union except for 2. He carried, back then we had 48 states, he carried 46 out of 48. Many Americans were so discouraged they said it's over. We've got the federal government doing the AAA. They're paying people not to produce. They're paying people to build roads. And then if you're a Republican, you don't get paid. The nation is done for. I want to suggest to you there's more hope than that. People look at the short sight, just like in the 20s they couldn't see the invention of talking movies and air conditioning and zippers. So you look at this, you can't see anything, but the nation is done for. After World War II, Thomas Gore's friend in the Senate, Senator Walter George of Georgia, when Roosevelt died in 1945, Senator Gore, ex-Senator Gore, talked with his friend, Senator George. Senator George went in and said, we need to cut taxes and get out of this depression. Under Walter George and the Republican Party, led by a guy named Senator Albert Hawks, also of New Jersey, campaigning against this, they blocked any income tax increase. We cut the tax rates below 94%. We cut the corporate tax from 90 to 37%. We just slashed it. We said more tax cuts are coming. We want to prosper. And after the war, we had television. We had developments like Xerox copying machines, you know, fast food. We had the Holiday Inn, a host, ballpoint pens, a host of inventions. We now are telling people again, you get to keep what you produce. We swung around, and the United States was going to have the next generations prosper because we reversed the policies we were following during the New Deal. Thomas Gore lived to see this happen. He lived to see, he was thrown out of office. It looked totally depressing. He lived to see the prosperity return when we followed a different set of policies. And I suggest to you today, those who are discouraging and telling you, oh, it's all over, are forgetting how quickly economic recovery can happen. Look at 1921, we go from 12 to 2% by cutting the tax rate and federal spending. As long as there are good ideas out there, and there are people who believe in those good ideas, they eventually will prevail over the bad ideas. Your generation can yet live to see this nation prosper and recover and get on the right economic path again, as previous generations have done. Your generation can do so as well. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Good evening. My name is Katie Batchelder, and I am a freshman from Hillsdale, Michigan. It is my privilege to introduce to you our speaker for this evening. Dr. Burt Folsom, Jr. studied at Centre College before receiving his BA from Indiana University. Dr. Folsom holds a master's degree from the University of Nebraska and a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. He has taught at Murray State University, Northwood University, and currently holds the Charles Klein Chair in History and Management at Hillsdale College. He also worked for several years at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy and the Center for the American Idea. He is currently a guest scholar at the Heritage Foundation, senior historian at the Foundation for Economic Education, and writes a quarterly column for the Freeman. His articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Business History Review, Investor's Business Daily, and the Washington Times, among others. He has made numerous radio and television appearances, including The Glenn Beck Show, Fox and Friends, and C-SPAN. He has published 6 books, including Myth of the Robber Barons and New Deal or Raw Deal, How FDR's Economic Legacy Has Damaged America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Folsom.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Katie, and thanks to Dr. Kaltoff and my colleagues in the history department. Thank you to Tim Kaspar and Doug Jeffrey for inviting me to this CCA, which is entitled FDR and the New Deal Love Fest. At least that's what it's entitled so far. Actually, I think it's delightful to get different points of view on a subject that is as important as this subject. And I especially admire the civility and the courteous behavior that we always show at Hillsdale College to our guests, whether we agree with the guests and speakers or not. I've learned my lessons actually on civility from FDR himself. Franklin Roosevelt was kind of practiced in the art of civility because he would hold these cabinet meetings or conferences, and often he would be in a situation where people would say, do you like this idea? Or do you like this person to be promoted or to hold a particular position? And Roosevelt, he didn't want to be in a position to say, no, this guy's a jerk, because then somebody surely would take it out of that meeting and go tell the guy that that's what Roosevelt said, right? And so, I mean, you don't want anything like that. So he didn't want to make any negative comments that might be taken and re-quoted later. And so Roosevelt had a way when he would be in these kinds of meetings, if anybody would make a suggestion, you know, do you think this person ought to be promoted to this position? If he didn't think so or didn't like him, he would just do this. And that pretty much got the message across, conveyed what he was thinking, and that way he didn't have to have anybody say that he'd said anything. So in that tradition, regarding some of the things that have been said in the New Deal CCA so far, my attitude a little bit is this. But don't quote me on it. You know, it is fun that we can laugh about ideas on something this important. This is one of the most important times in American history. The ideas that come out of the New Deal are absolutely exciting, absolutely important to study. And here at Hillsdale College, we bring in both sides. There are campuses all over America that if they would have a similar event such as this, or any other kind of event, it would be one totally dominated by political correctness. They would not have someone from the other side in. I have occasionally been invited to some of these to be the one person presenting the free market perspective. And I can say this, as I was watching the events as they've taken place today, never have I been treated as well on those campuses all around America as our campus here at Hillsdale treats people who come in here who may not be expressing ideas that the audience would be completely in agreement with. And I like that. When I was speaking, for example, one recently at UCLA, you know, a very liberal campus, and the audience, you know, they had a rough look to them. It was one of those audiences. They didn't have suits and ties and all this and name cards and all this. And so I was trying to pump myself up backstage. You know, you can do it, get in there, you know. The person who was organizing the event came up to me and introduced me to Manuel here, you know, this big guy. And he said, Manuel, he's your bodyguard. And he was with me the entire event until the time I left and got in a cab to leave. I had a bodyguard with me speaking on that campus. Now, at Hillsdale College, needless to say, I don't need a bodyguard. Well, except at the end of the semester when I'm delivering my grades to Central Hall, and then sometimes I might need one. But it's a much more civil atmosphere at Hillsdale College, and for that I appreciate. You know, getting into this subject of the New Deal and the ideas which we're talking about, I'd like to make 2 points right off. And the first point is, when we talk about the Great Depression, one of the points we need to get straight right off is that the government was heavily responsible for the damage that created the Great Depression. Now, some of that our speakers have already gotten into with the problems with the Federal Reserve, with raising interest rates and the disappearance of a fourth to a third of our money supply was very damaging. Milton Friedman, of course, eventually winning the Nobel Prize, and largely for his work on the Great Depression and the Federal Reserve and the problems that it caused. Also, another problem was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. We had the highest tariff in United States history that was passed in 1930. And this tariff raised prices heavily on over 1,000 items, and we had significant tariffs on over 3,200 items. And the problem that creates is this. If we're going to charge, say if Swiss watches are going to be $4, and if we're going to tell the Swiss, because that's their major export, we won't buy your watches except we'll pay you the $4, and then we'll put a $4 tariff on those watches, so they'll cost $8 over here, then we're not buying as many. And so we just close off our export-import market, and then Switzerland in turn enacts retaliatory tariffs, and they refuse to buy our products. And if you look at the auto industry, for example, we were selling 5 million cars, mostly out of Detroit here in Michigan, in 1929, and that was down to 1.5 million in 1933. Now, there were a variety of things involved with that, but the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was a critical factor in that. So the tariff is a factor in causing the Great Depression. And also, Herbert Hoover then proceeded to enact, with Congress's cooperation, of course, the highest peacetime set of taxes, income tax rates, excise taxes in U.S. history. And so that is going to make it so investors are not going to have incentives to invest. They're going to have incentives to retreat from investment, to put their money into tax-exempt bonds, foreign investments, this sort of thing. And you see the economy contracting, and we do indeed see the rate that has been mentioned by some of our speakers of 25% unemployment, which we had in 1932 and 1933. So my first point is that government was heavily involved in the causing of the Great Depression. That's the first point right off. And our second point that needs to be made is that if we're going to talk about the New Deal, and we're going to look at, was the New Deal successful to some extent? And our main measurement is going to be unemployment. To the extent that we're resolving the unemployment problem, then we have to say the New Deal was a failure. The New Deal was a failure. Up until the time of the Great Depression, we had never in our history had unemployment higher than 17%. That was the worst rate we'd ever had in U.S. history. Toward the end of Roosevelt's second term, he could no longer really blame Hoover at that point. In 1939, toward the end of his second term, unemployment in April was 20.7%, roughly 21%. 4 points higher 10 years after the Great Depression had started, and into Roosevelt's 7th year in the White House. 4 points higher than it had ever been in the history of the United States. And this was an absolute disaster. I begin my book, New Deal or Raw Deal, with this quotation from his Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, who's just pulling his hair. Morgenthau is a great friend of Roosevelt. The two of them, they'd been friends for decades. Roosevelt put Morgenthau into the Treasury Department because he wanted a friend there. And Morgenthau had been active in the political campaigns of Franklin Roosevelt. Their two wives were both named Eleanor. And Morgenthau and Roosevelt, they'd sometimes pass notes back to one another during cabinet meetings. They would have lunch regularly together. Eleanor one time said Henry Morgenthau was one of the two people who could tell Franklin Roosevelt to his face he was wrong and get away with it. Henry Morgenthau is saying this right after the unemployment statistics come in at almost 21% in 1939. He says, and this is a commentary on the New Deal, "We have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. And I have just one interest, and if I am wrong, somebody else can have my job. I want to see this country prosperous. I want to see people get a job. I want to see people get enough to eat. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started and an enormous debt to boot." Which is true. We had doubled the national debt in Roosevelt's years in office at that point, into his 7th year. And what I'm saying is this: we have 21% unemployment, 4 points higher than it had ever been in United States history before the Great Depression. And we had doubled the national debt. And that's our recovery program. Measured by unemployment and getting out of the Great Depression, the New Deal was a colossal failure. Now, it suggests government solutions do not work well. It suggests that the ideas of John Maynard Keynes do not work well. He had written his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. He'd even had an interview with Franklin Roosevelt. And he came to the conclusion that we needed to spend lots of money on public works. They called it aggregate demand management, that you would increase the amount of government spending. Of course, you have to tax people often to get those dollars or go into debt. And then you'd spend that, and you'd have a multiplier effect, and then you would be able to get out of a depression or a recession through that. Now, I say this is what Keynes seems to be saying, because if you read Keynes, you quickly learn that there's Keynesian English and there's English. I'm trying to summarize Keynes. Let me quote him on unemployment. Quote, men are, and this is from his book, men are involuntarily unemployed if, in the event of a small rise in the price of wage goods relative to the money wage, both the aggregate supply of labor willing to work for the current money wage and the aggregate demand for it at that wage would be greater than the existing volume of unemployment. Well, there you have it. You got it. Hey. The interpretation that was given to his writings was that we needed to invest, and we needed to invest heavily, public works, this sort of thing. Keynes himself said, boy, if we pulled all the houses down in South London and then rebuilt them, that'd put lots of people to work. Well, let's look at how we applied some of these ideas. They were in the air. Keynes wasn't the only one who had them. This was part of the progressive impulse of the early 1900s as it had evolved by the 1930s. And let's look at some of these programs. We've been reluctant to discuss some of them in a little bit of detail. We have the AAA for farmers, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Well, that's an interesting law. What we're going to do here, because we have an overproduction of farm products and farmers have low wages. So the ideas that we come up with, and this is a battle of ideas, is the idea is that we pay farmers not to produce. Now, if we pay farmers not to produce and take part of their land out of circulation in return, then the supply will be lower because we're taking land out of circulation, and the farmers will have more money because we're paying them not to produce. We also have a parity system to help raise the price of their crops, but the fundamental idea, we'll pay them not to produce, and then that will help alleviate the farm crisis. I'm sorry to have to say this. Only an academic could come up with an idea like that. Professor John D. Black, economist at Harvard, that was his brainchild, and there were others involved too. And it just was such a wonderful idea. We'll pay people not to produce. And it's interesting to look, because this is, again, the progressive impulse, the optimism that we can solve the problems of humankind. And here's how you first of all have a deal. Okay, we're going to let them take a quarter of their land out of circulation. We'll pay them roughly $10 an acre, which would be $100 an acre or so today, for each acre of land they take out of circulation, and then we won't have as much overproduction. Well, the first thing we find out is that farmers, once you tell them to do that and they agree to do it, some of them do it and some don't. I mean, they all take the money. They all agree to that. It's just some really maybe don't take their land out of circulation. So we have to send inspectors with measuring equipment to go by and measure all of their land to make sure they're really taking a fourth of it out of circulation. And then we discover, I hate to say this to the ears of Hillsdale students, some of the farmers bribed the inspectors. And you weren't going to fool our ag department, and so we had to send inspectors by to inspect the inspectors. We figured the cost of double bribing would be too high, and therefore it would make them honest. You know, this is my first year when I got out of graduate school. I was a new professor. I was teaching at a regional campus in Kentucky, and there were a lot of old Southern gentlemen on the faculty. It was my first year, and I wanted to get in good with them because I was hoping to get tenure, and I'm not a Southerner, and I was wanting to get in good with them. And one of the chairman of the tenure committee was going to go to a conference, and I was asked if I'd like to just come along. And I thought, hey, this is a real opportunity. You know, and I came along, and I thought maybe I didn't even know if he knew my name. You know, at least I can get to know him maybe. And so we were talking, and he was asking me what I had done in my life, and I asked him what he had done in his life. And he was going, well, when I was in college, I worked as an inspector for the AAA. And I just blurted out, did you take any bribes? He may have thought I was really anxious for tenure, I think. That may have been what I was trying to find out. But, you know, I just blurted it out, and it was funny. He says, no, the best offer I had was a new set of tires. And then he got really mad because he says, I had a friend, and he got all the good bribes. Well, we go through the inspectors who are coming on the land here, and that doesn't work real well. So then we have the bright idea to do aerial photography. So we're going to do aerial photography of all of this land to make sure they've taken the land out of circulation. So now look at this. We've got inspectors inspecting the inspectors' aerial photographs to make sure we take all of this land out of circulation. We take it out of circulation, and sure enough, in 1935, 2 years later, we have crop shortages. The United States has to import 34 million bushels of corn in 1935. And of course, we had our own global warming back then in the Midwest, and then the cooling, and then warming. And so we didn't have good crops in the Midwest, and 34 million bushels of corn we had to import, 13 million bushels of wheat. But it was even in the South this was going on. We imported 36 million pounds of cotton. What I'm telling you is we're going on into the South, onto cotton plantations, paying the people on those plantations not to produce, and then turning around and paying for imports, high-priced imports from foreigners to make up the difference. And that's our farm policy. We could go on to the National Recovery Act, the NRA. I don't want to talk too much about that. I thought Professor Brinkley was right. It was a disaster. We got businessmen together and said, why don't you set the prices you want to charge for your products, you think you ought to charge, and then we'll make those prices legally binding. And just to make sure, anybody who sells below that, we'll send them to jail. And so, I mean, there's a section of my book dealing with these people who went to jail. And it's really a very sad, for giving discounts to customers. One of them, Jacob Magid, was a tailor. And the NRA code for pressing a pair of pants was 40 cents. And his shop was off of Main Street in Jersey City, New Jersey. So see, he couldn't get people to come to his shop if he charged what everybody else was charging, the 40-cent rate. So he was giving discounts at 35 cents to press a pair of pants so that they'd walk a few blocks to get to his shop. Well, the NRA closed him down, sent him to jail, and we got a variety of comments on this. He's in jail, and he says, you can't tell me how to run my business. Well, they did tell him how to run it, and they put him in jail. I like this, though. The Washington Post said this. It didn't matter, the Washington Post said, if Magid had to charge less than the bright, shiny tailor shop up the street. If he wanted to continue to exist, the law said he couldn't. Now, I like this. For a parallel, the New York Herald Tribune said, for a parallel, it is necessary to go to the fascist or communist states of Europe. And we finally had the Supreme Court strike down the NRA, National Recovery Act, in 1935, and it's going to be off the books. But that was the plan for business. And we have those NRA papers in the Library of Congress. And someday, Hillsdale, we are represented, as you know now, in Washington, D.C. I think it would be fun to have some students do some papers right out of those original archives and see what else can be found on the National Recovery Act. Well, let's look at the Pump Priming Act, the WPA. That one was Works Progress Administration. You build roads, you build bridges, you build airports, you build schools. It sounds good in theory, doesn't it? You have unemployed people, and you put them to work building those roads and schools, a lot of roads. And you have that then that will reduce unemployment is the idea. But what we have to realize is $4.8 billion, which doesn't seem like a lot now when trillion is the only word that seems meaningful, but $4.8 billion was the largest investment in a domestic program that we had ever had in the United States before like this. It was $4,800,000,000. And so what this does is it gives Roosevelt this humongous pile of cash, and he ends up, because he has tremendous control over it, divvying it up into areas that he wants to capture the votes in that are politically expedient, who have congressmen or senators in those districts who will do what he says. And so this makes it an incredible program to subsidize much of the New Deal. I have some quotations, just gives you a flavor here of how a lot of Democrats were looking at the WPA. V.G. Copeland, the Democratic County Chairman of Indiana, said this, quote, "What I think will help is to change the WPA management from top to bottom. Put men in there who are in favor of using these Democratic projects to make votes for the Democratic Party." That is the heart of a lot of the New Deal. James Doherty, a New Hampshire Democrat, agreed, quote, "It is my personal belief that to the victor belongs the spoils, and that Democrats should be holding most of those WPA positions so that we might strengthen our fences for the 1940 election." I like one WPA director in New Jersey. I have in my book, "A Corrupt but Candid Man." Answered his telephone, quote, "Democratic headquarters." So you have the chairman of the WPA answering his phone, Democratic headquarters. They have a file in the National Archives on WPA/political corruption, and it's huge, and it's by state. And if you look at that, you find things like this. Frank Towie of New Jersey announced at a Democratic rally in Newark, New Jersey, quote, "In this county, there are 18,000 people on the WPA. With an average of 3 people in a family, you have 54,000 potential Democratic votes. Can anyone beat that if it is properly mobilized?" Do you see here how Franklin Roosevelt is winning elections? See, one of the problems in analyzing the New Deal is the programs didn't work, but the fallback position of Roosevelt's defenders often is, well, yes, but he must have given people hope and change. And we know that because he was winning elections and winning them big. See? In other words, he would have his fireside chats and people would listen and he would give them hope. And look at these jobs and these people working on these jobs. So he was trying, he was doing his best, and you have to therefore give him credit for that. But what you have to see is that this money, which you can understand why the founders were so specific in Article 1, Section 8, not letting all of these programs be part of the federal government. To federalize all this is to put into the hands of a president a huge political war chest. It's interesting to listen to these are Democrats who voted for Roosevelt. These are his friends who are saying this. I don't quote his enemies because at Hillsdale College, we believe in G and PG lectures. And so I'm quoting his friends. And here's what his friends say. The Democratic senator from Virginia, Carter Glass, says this: "The 1936 elections would have been much closer had my party not had a $4,800,000,000 relief bill as campaign fodder." In other words, you target congressional districts. You target key states. Pennsylvania was a swing state, very important. The Democrats had not carried it in decades and decades. Roosevelt wanted it. Lots of WPA money into Pennsylvania. You target the key states. You tell the people running as Democrats to mention all the programs that are coming into the states, and then you say, if you would like this to continue, vote for Roosevelt and vote the Democratic ticket. And as one Republican said after the election, apparently you can't beat Santa Claus. And that's what happened in the 1936 election. A tremendous victory for Roosevelt. And I don't mean it was just the WPA. See, there are a whole lot of programs that just sometimes get missed in the textbook. For example, how many have heard of the Silver Purchase Act? You know, we were busily purchasing silver. It was a subsidy to 6 Western states to get their votes, which Roosevelt did. What you do is the normal price of silver, which is a main industry in those Western states, it was roughly, the market price was about 40 cents an ounce. The Silver Purchase Act, which Roosevelt signed, would pay silver miners 64.5 cents an ounce. See, in other words, it would pay them almost 50% more than the market value of silver. And so the law of unintended consequences comes in, and there's this huge outpouring of silver in the West. In fact, it wasn't just in the West. We had people in Mexico smuggling silver across the border. Because you buy it at 40 and you can sell it at 64.5, so we had issues of silver imports coming in. And according to the rules of the Silver Purchase Act, you couldn't get rid of it. I mean, sure, you were making some silver for industrial uses, but this had to be stockpiled. After 8 years of stockpiling silver, we had 42,000 tons of silver, according to that act the federal government had. I mean, I just don't know what kind of shape this is in. I mean, it's almost like the Tower of Babel, you know, going up there where God says, don't do this, as it goes up, up, up. Let me try. Everybody, close your eyes for a minute. Everybody, close your eyes. Amelia, make sure, wrap their knuckles if they're not closing. Don't fall asleep on me, promise. Close your. Try to imagine a mountain of 42,000 tons of silver. Imagine what it looks like, 42,000 tons. Okay. I had you do that because so much of the defenders of Roosevelt approach the problem this way. They say, think of it this way. Lots of people having jobs, and they're working on the jobs, and he's trying to get us out of the Great Depression. Well, one way to get around this is to say, yeah, look at the tax dollars going out of a lot of people's wallets into those jobs, which are doing things like piling 42,000 tons of silver into a big pile. I hope someone here, you know, when you write your essays on the CCA, draw the most imaginative diagram of 42,000 tons of silver. Listen, I'll give a copy of my book to the most imaginative drawing of 42,000 tons of silver, how that looks like and how that was done. What you have to have a vision here is money, see dollars going out of the wallets of everybody all over the country, flowing over there into the western states, and then see in Washington a mountain of 42,000 tons of silver, which constitutes 2%, almost 2% of the entire national debt. Almost 2% of our entire national debt in a big mountain of silver, which we're not allowed to get rid of. And this is what was supposed to get us out of the Great Depression. It didn't do it. There's no silver lining in that cloud. You know, some of this is tragic because in World War II, we finally got to spend the silver. Because, I mean, we had to for industry, and then Roosevelt was worried he wouldn't be able to carry those western states. And I mean, some of this is very tragic because that's when we began rounding up the Japanese, 110,000 Japanese. Once you begin to centralize power and increase it in the state, then we get the rounding up of Japanese, which is very popular with a lot of the same people who are now mad because you're using up their silver. Now they're happy because they've got the Japanese out of circulation. It's sad to read. Eric Muller, in his recent book, American Inquisition, documents how Roosevelt knew in 1942, 1943 that those Japanese were loyal, that many of them were fighting overseas in a very loyal way to the United States, but he would not let them out because he said if they come out in the 1944 election, which I plan to run for a 4th term, what will happen is they'll be mad at us in those western states. And that becomes a reason. You have to see the politics of all of this. The politics of federal programs, centralizing power, the use of those programs to, in effect, bribe or buy votes, then win re-election and change American politics forever, because the other side, poor Alf Landon running against Roosevelt said, oh, this AAA is terrible. And then Roosevelt said, well, what are you going to do? And, a lot of farmers said, you're going to take our subsidy away? Well, no, I won't take your subsidy away. He said, I'll manage it better. So what you get a choice in 36 is, do you vote for the guy who gave you your subsidy or the guy who alleges that he will manage it better? And that's been part of the dilemma of the Republican Party ever since, how to respond to that. This has to be paid for with taxes. You almost never see a New Deal book that discusses taxes. It has to be discussed. If you're going to discuss the programs and you're going to talk about those, and some were better than others, and some were worse than others, then you've got to talk about how we're going to spend for those programs. And we need to make a statement right off that we had very high taxes on the wealthy people. Roosevelt raised the top rate on the federal income tax to 79% in 1935. In other words, we're asking investors, this is a marginal rate, the top rate, to give up 4/5 of all their income past a certain level to invest in companies. And then we find, lo and behold, they don't do it. And Roosevelt is angry, and he builds his 1936 campaign against these people. And he said, they hate me, and I welcome their hatred. That's what Roosevelt said during the campaign. And in 1937, we hear talk, well, Roosevelt cut spending, and that was no good. First of all, we need to make a point. It's true. After the 36 election into 37, we slightly cut spending. It was not big, and we still were running a big deficit. Why did we cut spending slightly? Because we always cut spending slightly after an election. Roosevelt had just been reelected. So the WPA dropped in numbers because we don't need those people anymore. So we did have sort of a drop in spending. But what we also have that is not often mentioned is we had an undistributed profits tax, a special tax on corporations. We had Roosevelt with encouraging, to some extent, mandatory collective bargaining, which is going to take place, and we're going to get the unionization of the auto companies and others, and we're going to get a minimum wage law that's passed, which is with us today, and that minimum wage law is going to prevent employers from hiring people who cannot add enough value that the minimum wage demands to hire them in their company, and that's going to contribute to unemployment. And then FDR turns the IRS loose against people, Andrew Mellon, he turned it loose against Moses Annenberg. Moses Annenberg edited the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Philadelphia Inquirer ran editorials condemning Roosevelt. So Annenberg discovers, whoa, the IRS investigation is there. He owes money. He goes to prison. And then we find the editor of the Philadelphia Record, which was a Democratic paper, they're getting a loan from Roosevelt's, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, for somewhat the same amount as Annenberg was having to pay back in tax liabilities. And so now we have the Democrats getting a subsidy, the Republican being put in prison on an IRS investigation. Roosevelt then said in 1938 and 39 to Morgenthau, we need to go after all of these rich people with an IRS investigation. And Morgenthau said, well, wait a minute here. Why do we do that? And Roosevelt said, and I quote, because it can gain us 10 million votes. We condemn the rich. We blame them for not hiring people. We go over to unemployed people and say it's their fault. And then when they don't hire, we can blame them. Then that justifies starting a public works program from the taxes which we're taking from them so that they can't expand their factories. This is the heart of the New Deal. And it raises a question, and the last one I want to get at, and then we'll open this up for questions, because we've had this issue of what ends the Great Depression. Yeah, what ends the Great Depression? That's a tough one, and I don't want to pretend as though we have absolute answers. There's research still in progress on this. But I would like to say a couple things. You can't very well end a depression. you could ask Dr. Wolfram here on campus, by building stuff and bombing people and say that that's getting you out of a Great Depression. I really urge you to take Econ 105, and you'll get the full story on that, but let me give you the abridged version. You have here 12 million people we're sending overseas. Now that's good, from an unemployment sense, that's good because we had a little bit less than that who were unemployed. So we're sending 12 million overseas, and then we have 12 to 15 million people working in the defense industry. So I think you can see, therefore, unemployment goes way down. By the way, which is interesting because the WPA for a while is still going in the midst of this because Roosevelt still had elections going on here. But in any case, put that aside. We've got 12 million people overseas in the military. We have 12 to 15 in defense industries. That's well and good, but as we've had pointed out by speakers already, the national debt then goes from $40 billion to $260 billion. So see, what we've in effect done is we've taken all those people, subsidized them while they go dropping bombs on places, and now we have a debt of $260 billion. We increased the national debt by sixfold. In other words, we started the war with about $40 billion national debt, then we're up to $260 billion. My goodness, the interest rate on the $260 billion is almost as much as the whole national debt was before that. I mean, not quite, the debt was a little bit higher than that, but I mean, it gets you thinking, my gosh, this is a huge national debt. So we didn't solve the Great Depression. In fact, the issue is, what are we going to do after the boys come home? And many New Dealers said, oh, we need a New Deal. They called it the New Deal Revival. We're going to get a host of new federal programs to bring them back. They were not successful. In fact, they were distinctly unsuccessful, and you had, and I quote from Congress here, Senator Walter George in October 24th, 1945, talks about a bill to cut tax rates to get us out of the Great Depression. He says, you're right, we're going to get into the Great Depression is going to go on after the war if we continue the New Deal. He says, there are people out there who want to rebuild our stockpile of silver. And so he said, we need tax cuts because that's what we tried in the 1920s when the top rate was 25%, and that is what worked then. Andrew Mellon said in the 1920s, our Secretary of Treasury in the 20s, and I quote, it seems difficult for some to understand that high rates of taxation do not necessarily mean large revenue to the government, and that more revenue may often be obtained by lower rates. In other words, he's saying if you cut the rates, it may, in addition to encouraging investment, it may actually increase revenue. He was right on both counts. Calvin Coolidge had the lowest inflation and unemployment rate of any president of the 20th century. We had budget surpluses every year of the 1920s. We chopped off almost a third of the national debt. And we had senators who remembered that in 1945 and said, let's go back to that and try that because the spending stuff isn't working. Here's what Senator Walter George, another Democrat, who had been enlightened on this issue, and here's what he says. He's talking about this bill to cut tax rates. And I might add, just so I describe this bill specifically, it cut the income tax rate, because after the war, the income tax rate was 94% on top incomes. I always like to say to FDR that 6% was money left on the table, you know. But it was 94% on top incomes, and the corporate rate was, the top rate was 90%. This bill was going to lower the top income tax rate some, but the big lowering was the corporate rate because we were removing this excess profits tax, and we were cutting it from 90% to 38% as a top rate. That was the proposal. Senator George says this bill is properly a tax rate reducing bill. It will not necessarily reduce the amount of revenue coming in. Indeed, if it has the effect which it is hoped it will so stimulate the expansion of business as to bring in a greater total revenue. I think if one will look back to World War I, he will understand precisely what I am trying to say. Senator from New Jersey, Albert Hawks, who was a businessman in the Senate, said this: the repeal of the excess profits tax, in my opinion, may raise more revenue for the United States than would be raised if it were retained. those bills come into effect, and indeed we do, over a period of 3 or 4 years, see a sharp increase in revenue to the government. But more than that, we sent a message to business people: we're cutting your taxes. We want you to invest again in the American economy. And they did in tremendous amounts, and we had only 3.9% unemployment in 1946 and 1947. The tax cuts, I think, played a big role in getting us out of the Great Depression. Now, some people say, well, you've dug this up in congressional records, you know, how can people understand and get at that? Well, the reason I have these quotations is they were given to me by my research assistant here at Hillsdale College, Jim Nesbitt, who went home and over break at Cincinnati, Ohio, went into the University of Cincinnati, dug up this information, brings it in, and now I'm quoting it. I think if Hillsdale students can do it, that my fellow historians can do it too. I regret that the New Deal failed. It was an abysmal failure. It sent us on the wrong direction. But we were able to overcome pieces of it, definitely, and that tax cut going into effect, producing more economic growth, is a remarkable example of that. President Reagan, as you know, President Kennedy, even in the 60s, and then Reagan in the 80s, also cut taxes, and they saw tremendous economic growth and a lowering of unemployment. And I would like to suggest not stimulus packages and not priming the pumps with WPAs, and certainly not the Keynesian argument that we absolutely need to have vast public works, but cutting taxes, and don't let central planners and presidents determine what politically good districts they're going to send the money into. Let business people and American people invest, start up businesses, expand existing ones, put people to work, invent and develop television and those things after the war, and send the American economy on a prosperous route with relative freedom and limited government. Thank you.
Good evening, and welcome to our first Trading Psychology webinar with our very own Director of Trading Psychology, Benjamin Lee. We are very excited to have Ben with us tonight. This is going to be the first of 3 of a series whose theme is how to stop your mind from stealing from you. And webinar 1 is called How Your Fear is the Enemy of Profit. And so without further ado, drum roll please, I'm going to turn it over to Benjamin Lee. Ben, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate that. Again, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar series, How to Stop Your Mind from Stealing from You. As Peter said, this is the first webinar, which will focus on how your fear is the enemy of profit. And as Peter said, I'm Benjamin Lee, the Director of Trading Psychology for ShadowTrader.net. And Peter and I are excited to share what has taken us a long time, actually the last 3 years, to create something so we can help traders like you to reach your full potential and consistently make money on a daily basis. We went back and forth for what started as hours, which eventually morphed into days, weeks, months, and years to ensure that we're giving you the best of everything from the decades of experience that we have. So we hope you all derive as much value from our shared knowledge as possible and can implement some of the tools and strategies that we'll share with you here. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, before we start, just a little housekeeping, just a little quick disclaimer. Forex futures and options trading has large potential risk, but also large potential rewards, but also large potential risk. The high degree of leverage can work against you as well as for you. You must be aware of the risks of investing in futures, forex, and options, and be willing to accept them in order to trade these markets. Forex futures and options trading involves substantial risk and loss and is not suitable for all investors. Please do not trade with borrowed money or money you cannot afford to lose. Any commentary, strategies, tools, opinions, news, research, analyst prices, or other information contained in this presentation is provided as general market or trading psychology commentary and does not constitute investment advice. Shadow Trader or its affiliates will not accept liability for any loss or damage, including, without limitation to, any loss of profit which may arise directly or indirectly from the use of or reliance on such information. Please remember that past performance of any trading system or methodology is not necessarily indicative of future results. Okay, so now we have the housekeeping out of the way. Let's get started. All right. So as we look at this picture here, right, isn't this every trader's dream? I mean, look at how happy he looks.
Yeah, except they should be hundreds, Ben.
Couldn't find, fair enough. I couldn't find hundreds. I'll make sure I get hundreds next time.
All right, thank you.
But look at his face. I mean, that is such a peaceful, just serene look on his face. Right? Imagine just being able to sit back and just have money falling from the skies. Now, how many of you actually feel this way when you trade? Right? Think about it. How many of you actually are just sitting there, you're just enjoying yourself, and the money just flowing towards you? At first it actually might happen. It's a rush for some of you, but things start to change very rapidly, either gradually when you start incurring losses, or quite possibly as a very, very large trading loss or trading day. So some of you may not feel a lot different from this, right? But most of the people that I've spoken to, the traders that have been around, you've probably felt your heart rate increasing when you trade, probably bite your nails, your hands or your brow starts sweating, your stomach starts to turn, and then your mind starts going in places into rabbit holes and starts thinking about the worst things that can happen. So how many of you have actually experienced this, any of these symptoms before? And I'm sure a lot of you have. I can speak to this because I have as well. So really what we need to think about is how we can move from this and we can actually unlock our profits by working on our mind. So if you felt those symptoms, I mentioned earlier, I'm willing to bet that you felt them multiple times or possibly even on a daily basis. So how do you minimize, manage, and overcome those physical manifestations that arise from your mind so you can move towards unlocking your full potential and start making money every single time you trade? Well, the first step is becoming aware of the issues at hand and know that you have the power to change them. I know that some of you are going to think that's a very cliche statement, and it might be easy for me to say, but think about all the times you've ever tried to learn something or have tried to help somebody with learning something. A great example of that is learning how to walk. A newborn can't move by itself, so it relies on his or her parents to basically move them around. A toddler will start to crawl and eventually begin to walk, but when he or she starts to walk, they have no idea they can't walk. Right? When they first try, they're given some great feedback, like, hey, your parents and everyone else that sees it, they love that you're, starting to walk. And that's when they decide, that they want more of that, right? But they won't walk very far if they do. And that's when they realize, hey, listen, I really can't walk as well as everyone else, and that's when they become aware. It's a really great metaphor for what you're trying to go through with your trading experiences. One day, you will have an epiphany or an aha moment and realize how important trading psychology is to your long-term success. So let's delve a little deeper into the different stages of learning. Okay. So here are the 4 stages of learning. It all starts with unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence. So please note that the time and distance between each of those stages is not drawn to scale. So think about the process from stage 3 to stage 4 as being considerably and parabolically longer than going from stage 1 to stage 2. And you'll see what I'm talking about in a minute. So let's use your trading journey as an example and learn about the different stages of learning. So before you started trading, right, before you decided to start trading, you had no idea what you didn't know. That's unconscious incompetence. You had no idea what market profile was. You had no idea what depth of market was. You didn't know what a limit order was, what a stop limit order was. You didn't know because you didn't need to know, right? It isn't until the second stage that you start to uncover the necessary information you'll need to become a trader. So it's very easy for you to progress from stage 1 to stage 2. And the second stage is conscious incompetence, which stems from you learning, becoming aware, and having an aha moment that you didn't know what you didn't know. Here's where you can make a conscious decision whether or not you want to get more involved with trading. You can either decide that trading isn't important to you and just leave it alone, or you can commit to learning more about trading. Once you make that conscious decision, it'll take a little bit of time for you to progress to that next level. So there's a series of steps that you'll need to go through, such as getting the necessary equipment, getting a trading computer, getting the software, purchasing a trading system, and beginning to learn through trial and error. You'll figure out strategies and tools that will work for you, and then you'll start to eliminate ones that don't. And eventually you'll get to conscious competence. You'll have a solid base of knowledge and start to develop a kind of a muscle memory. And again, one of the things in trading that you'll begin to develop is just an eye and a gut feeling towards certain patterns that occur every once in a while. And as you build that conscious competence, right, you'll be able to make money most of the days, but probably have 1 or 2 bad days that kind of wipes out all the profit that you've made previously. But when you trade, it still takes a lot of brain power and a lot of thought for you to execute your trading system. So you haven't memorized everything yet, and you're still continuously making new distinctions almost on a daily basis. So you'll get to the point where you'll be turning the corner, and this is the one thing that people always ask me, hey, how are you doing your trading? I always just say, hey, I'm turning the corner, but you'll realize that that corner is pretty long and pretty big. And then the last stage is unconscious competence. And this is where you know your trading system in every single trade like the back of your hand. You have systems in place for everything that you need, from overcoming trading losses to risk management systems. You'll have your daily trading plan. You'll have a trading journal. You'll have everything that you need to be successful. And even more so, like, for example, you'll be able to tell anyone at any time how and why each of your trades is supposed to work and understand the nuances that best support that type of trade. And that's something that I call the trading criteria. And I'll speak to that at length and show you how to create your own in the new course that we just created in Module 3, Taming the Fear and Anxiety Monster. So now you can see the journey that's laid out in front of you. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that it's easy. This is some of the most difficult work I've ever done in my life. It took Peter and I years to get to the point that we're at, but it does come with incredible rewards, such as when I day traded for 8 months without a losing day minus commissions. So you can get there, but you have to dedicate yourself. You have to commit yourself. You have to realize, this is not an easy journey. You won't get there from point A to point B. It's point A to point Z, where you go from A to B and all the way through, right? But Peter and I will tell you, it is one of the most rewarding journeys you can ever attempt, because as you become a better trader, you become a better person as well. Okay, so here's how I structured the webinars. The first one, as I mentioned, is how your fear is enemy of profit. Then the second one is finding consistency and stop giving your profits back to the market. And the last one is how to become a master trader. And the reason why I structured the webinar in this way is because I asked Peter to send out a question about what were your all's #1 trading psychology issue. And I got back a great feedback, so I really appreciate you guys sending that to me. And I found that one of the major ones was fear. Talking about fear of loss, getting out of trades too early, and there was a very many emails that were sent that dealt with fear. And that's one of the things that you kind of deal with in the very beginning of your trading career, right? And as you become to a better trader, as you become to certain experiences that will kind of help you control and eliminate your fear, then you start finding consistency, right? But I remember there was a time in my trading career where I would be consistent. I would trade for 2 or 3 weeks. I would make some significant profits, and then all of a sudden, in one day or in a couple days, I would lose it all and give it all back, right? So how do you get past that point, and then how do you become a master trader to the point where you can basically recreate everything at ease, and bring the best version of yourself to your trading every single day. So really, it's just the 3 stages of development for being a trader, right? From the very beginning, deal with a lot of fear. The second part is you're starting to understand your trading system. You're getting consistent, but you're still giving back profits to the market. And then the last part is how do you actually integrate everything? And then you're making money, but you're still limiting your risk and not giving too much back to the market when you do have those losing trades or those losing days. And you'll learn something that you can implement from each of these webinars, no matter which stage you're in. So if you're a beginner, intermediate, advanced trader, there's something that you can gain value from each of these webinars. And everything you learn here, and in every educational piece that I create, it all works synergistically together, right? It builds on top of one another, and really it helps create a holistic approach to mastering your trading psychology. Where is, there it is. Yep. All right, there we are. So what is fear and anxiety? Well, fear is a feeling that's induced by perceived danger or a threat that occurs in certain types of organisms, which causes a change in metabolic and organ functions and ultimately a change in behavior, such as fleeing, hiding, or freezing from perceived traumatic events. Fear in human beings may occur in response to a specific stimulus occurring in the present or in anticipation of a future threat perceived as a risk to body or life. So if you think about it, what is the key word throughout that entire definition? Think about it for a second. It actually occurs twice. It's perceived, okay? Perceived threat. Perceived danger. When your mind thinks it's in danger, it's going to fire off a series of cascading physical responses, just like we spoke about earlier. Increased heart rate, sweaty palms, and your mind starts racing and thinking about the worst case scenario that could happen in your trade. But why does this happen? It's because your subconscious mind is programmed to protect you from danger and harm. It's an evolutionary mechanism that protected us from lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, when we were living in the jungle. But we don't have to deal with that anymore, right? But it also keeps us from causing harm or getting into danger today. That's why we have our fight or flight response, and that's what it talks about in the later part of the first part of the definition, right? Such as fleeing, hiding, or freezing from perceived traumatic events. And when that does happen, your body physiologically changes, when your mind senses real or perceived danger. So I remember working with a trader whose subconscious would actually hijack him completely when he was trading. So in other words, he would almost like black out. He'd be trading, and then all of a sudden he would start getting angry, and then he would revenge trade to a point where he couldn't control himself anymore. So I helped him with it, and really it was an identification of basically his amygdala was hijacking him. He would get so angry, and when he got into those specific episodes, there were times when he lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the challenge for us is that we must overcome the subconscious and not let it hijack our higher brain functions, especially when we're trading. And I've dedicated an entire module, which is module 4 of the course, which is called Taming the Fear and Anxiety Monster, in the course specifically for this. So what's anxiety? So anxiety is an emotion characterized by an unpleasant state of inner turmoil, often accompanied by nervous behavior such as pacing back and forth, somatic complaints, and rumination. If you think about it, anxiety is a much less powerful form of fear. But if you leave it unchecked, it can evolve into full-blown fear. So you also need to be able to control any anxiety that may arise when you're trading. Because if you're constantly anxious when you trade, it'll make it more difficult for you to stay calm, to be level-headed, and to make the proper decisions when you're trading. What can also happen if you don't eliminate or control your anxiety is wear yourself down and shorten your trading career. I mean, who in their right mind would want to put themselves on edge and be anxious every single day, right? It's just not sustainable. Even if you wanted to, even if you were making thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of dollars a day, right? It's just not sustainable on a physiological level. So you need to figure out what needs to happen for you to take control of your fear and anxiety. Now we're going to look through some emails you sent to us and then work through the case studies together. All right, hopefully you guys can read this. Can you guys read that?
Yeah, Ben, that looks good. It's clear.
Okay, perfect. All right, wonderful. All right, so Peter, I have many trades where my entry is excellent. That's to say, good trade location, good risk reward, etc. However, after I get in, if it starts to go sideways or slightly against me, I get nervous and bail, usually with a small loss or break even. In other words, I do not stay with the plan to put and keep a stop below or above my good trade location. I can't tell you how many times that trade would not have hit my original stop and then goes on for a large gain. I'm trying to work on my discipline to keep my stop in place above or below my good trade location, but I find it hard. I'm trying to watch the chart and not focus on the P&L, but it is tough. All right, and then he goes into describing the actual trade. So how many of you have actually had this issue before, where you get into a trade and then for some reason or another you start to get out because for some reason you felt some anxiety, right? Or a stronger form of that is fear. Okay. Well, here's what I would do, okay? Really, if you think about it, fear is a particular emotion. And one thing that I've learned from a mentor of mine, Tony Robbins, I'm actually going to go see him in LA I think next week, actually, yeah, on the 23rd. So I've been going to him for quite a number of years, and he's got great information. One of the things that he always talks about is you can only have one emotion in your mind or in your body at any particular time. So if you're happy, you're happy. If you're fearful, you're fearful. If you're sad, you're sad. If you have gratitude, then then you can only feel gratitude in that moment. So one of the easy things that you can do is to focus on a different emotional state that could be more empowering for you into actually focusing on the fear. Now I know that might seem a little more difficult than just saying it, so here's some other things that you can do. So one of the things that I actually helped Peter with was what I call the trading criteria. And what that is, it's a worksheet that details every single trade that you take. So every single setup that you have, every single exit that you have, and identifying exactly what you need for the trade. So in other words, you write a synopsis of the trade from before it begins to after you exit, right? So you talk about all the different points in between. So what kind of entry you use, how you actually manage that trade, what you're going to do to maximize that trade, when is it best used. So it's understanding every single trade setup, like the back of your hand. So Peter, if you would, how did that help you?
So that was a good exercise because, I actually want to tell people that this is actually where the top 10 futures day trading setups came from. A lot of you have enjoyed that very much, and I've gotten a lot of great feedback on that over the last couple of years. And I just wanted to mention, I'm glad you brought this up, Ben, that didn't exist until I started working with Ben. It was actually Ben's idea for me to write those out. And I guess from my perspective, looking back on it, Ben, I mean, it's all extremely helpful. You and I talked about a number of things in depth, but I think that when you write out the process like that, it does maybe two things. I think that it starts little by little to separate the emotion out of it, take some of that anxiety and that emotion out of the process. And then I think what it also does is reminds you that to trade well, it is a process of start to finish, that if you just concentrate on just one part of it, you'll generally fail. Like if it's all about just finding the trade for you and you know nothing about managing it, you'll probably fail. If it's all about just getting into the trade for you and you know nothing about targets or stops, you'll probably fail. So I think that whenever we break things down into their component parts and we treat it like a process and we actually write it out, and give ourselves very specific things to look for. Like, for instance, it's very easy for somebody who has traded successfully for some time to just be like, well, I don't really know what I do. It's just kind of a feel, and I just kind of see it. But in reality, that's not really true, because it's really like, I know what to do when I see it. So it's just a very positive thing to write all that down and really take a couple of days and think about it and say, okay, so when I do feel good and I do pull the trigger, what exactly am I seeing? And in writing it out, not only are you identifying it, but you're also opening yourself and the process up to improvement. And that's super important in trading, super, super important, because the status quo in trading will just kill you. Even if you don't start losing money, you'll just start to get burned out. This happens to me all the time. I have very long periods where it's just like a plateau, and it's steady, and it's cool, and I'm winning, but, maybe the size isn't big enough. It's just not really, getting excited. So it can help with that as well. So that's basically it.
Great. Yeah, and you mentioned when you were speaking where some traders, when you ask them, hey, how do you trade? And they're like, well, I don't really know. That's actually when they get to stage 4 of learning. They're unconsciously competent, where they're able to identify distinctions and pattern recognition at such a high level that they don't even realize it anymore. They're not even thinking about it. So that's why another name for that is being in the zone. So they're basically in the zone. They don't need to think about it. They just operate, and they're just there, and it's just second nature to them.
Yeah, exactly.
And then also another piece of that is when you're talking about confidence. How many of you have actually been in a trading room where the moderator says, oh, I'm entering this trade, right? And when they enter the trade, you're always a step behind, and then when they get out of the trade, you're always a step behind. That's because they know what system they're using. They know the reason why they're getting in. They know the reason why they're getting out. You don't know that, so it's much more difficult for you to hold on to a trade or even enter a trade. So one of the things that the trading criteria really helps with is to identify the holes in your knowledge for each of the trades, right? Because if you can understand the nuances of what makes a trade work best, then you can start to identify those and then only take those trades when those scenarios or those pieces of criteria are actually available in the market. And then another thing what I would speak to is having an actual daily trading plan. This is something that we discuss a lot, Peter. One of the things that I do whenever I'm having whenever I'm actually trading, I have to write my trading plan every single morning before I trade, and that identifies all the things that occurred in the previous trading day. I have to identify what's going on contextually in the market, and then I look at what could happen the next day, and then I identify at least 3 different scenarios. Because if I do that, then it makes me look through what the market could do, and then I'm actually preparing myself for anything that could happen, and then I really try to avoid directional bias when I do that, right? Because I know a lot of people have actually mentioned, that in the emails. How do I get away from having a particular directional bias? Or if I see the market going down, but I thought it was going up, then I can't enter a trade to the downside because I was thinking up the entire time. So having a trading plan where you can identify at least 3 to 4 different scenarios is extremely important. So I know you do that as well, right, Peter?
Yeah, most definitely. And I also just want to say is that since you mentioned that, Ben, the trading plan that you put into the Trading Psychology series, one of the things that you get is it's your trading plan, and I think there's also a sample from somebody else, if I'm not mistaken, right? Mm-hmm. Anyway, the one that you did is just ridiculous in how comprehensive it is. Like, if you guys get the program and you look at this, like, you'll see that it's a huge value just for that. And I don't even know if how many people are going to go through that level of detail, but it's really cool because Ben has literally created like the ultimate plan where, like, I mean, I don't know how long your pre-market preparation has been, but when you look at this thing, you're going to be like, oh my God, I have to wake up at 5 in the morning to fill this out, you know? But the beauty of it is that it's there for you, and you certainly don't have to, you can take it as comprehensive as you want. So you can take Ben's plan and just chip out pieces of it that you like, customize it to your own benefit, and, you know, take it from there. But anyway, I just had to mention it because I remember when we were putting together the course, I was like, whoa, this thing is freaking incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it actually takes me an hour to do it, but I split it in between either right after I trade or the evening, and then also in the morning. Mm-hmm. So I try to get all the the information I can answer in the beginning, and then I also save the contextual pieces to apply to the next trading day, or what my scenarios are for the next day, for the next morning.
Nice.
You know, after the Globex market has has been over, because again, so much can change in the overnight sometimes.
Right, of course.
Yeah. And then the last piece, we talk about how, in this particular email, being disciplined with, your plan. One of the things, with developing, discipline, you really have to take into account cognitive dissonance, and that's one of the things that we speak at at length to. Forgetting which module it was, but I believe it's module 8, cognitive dissonance, and how that really wreaks havoc on your trading. Because if you have a particular scenario in mind, like let's say you're entering a trade, right? You can still see information that says the market is going to go in your direction, and then you see information that goes against that as well. So the ability for you to identify when you have that cognitive dissonance, and some strategies on how to eliminate it. Any comments on that, Peter?
On the cognitive dissonance?
Yes.
No, not specifically, but you are correct. That is in Module 8, and that is a big thing, because that speaks to the concept of not being able to hold those competing ideas in your mind. And I just wanted to mention that from my own personal experience, that has helped me a lot in overcoming that, or the overcoming of that has helped me a lot. One of the things that I feel I get from traders very often. I say this a lot on Brad's show. You'll hear me sometimes talk about the emails that I get, and I don't mention any names, but I'll just say, like, it's so obvious to me that, like, this guy's bearish, or it's so obvious to me that this woman is, like, so bullish, or whatever. And in being that, it's like they absolutely positively can't see anything else but that. Anything else that's conflicting is just not happening in their mind, and they're closing themselves off from so many short-term opportunities in between. And especially in the type of markets that we have had in the last few years, where volatility has gone down. I think that as the years go by, it gets harder and harder to make money. Certainly there's more automation out there or whatever. You really have to have a well-rounded approach, I think, which means multiple time frames in action. And in order to successfully be able to be in multiple time frames, even if you're not in the multiple time frames at the same time, like I'm kind of talking about being in them at the same time, but even just being able to trade them in and out so that you move from one to the other. So you put on a longer term trade, and then you go, and then, okay, so that is going to tie you up for 2 weeks. You've got nothing to do. And then that you can do shorter term trades during that time that are actually against the bias of the longer one. This is super important. It really just helps you immensely if you can get, kind of push past that whole thing.
Yeah, it's tough too. And the challenge that, when we speak about biases is your subconscious mind will, again, protect you from pain or danger, right? And one of the things that it'll do to your detriment sometimes is, if you have a really, really strong bias in one direction, is it'll only filter information that supports your position. It'll actually delete all the information. Yeah. And one of the things that we talk about is the NLP communication model, and how we actually absorb information. So you have the the different senses, right? So you have all the different submodalities. You have visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, auditory. Is that right? And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But yeah, I believe that's it. But the thing is, when you're actually living in any single moment, right? When you're here, just present, you're actually getting inundated with, I forget how many millions of bits of information at a time in 1 second. So the thing is, what your mind will get really good at doing, it'll delete, distort, and generalize a lot of the information coming to you, right? So if you have information that supports your trade, your subconscious is going to give you that information, even though you have all this other data that tells you, you know what, you should probably get out of the trade now.
And that's what I meant, Ben, when I said about that when certain people email me, I can feel it in the email because I see them only highlighting those factors that seem to support their bias, and they're not mentioning or completely ignoring what's right in front of them. And therein, I know that there's got to be this dissonance has to be occurring.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, let's take a look at another case study here, another email. All right. Hello, Peter. I am fairly new to day trading. I have a good method with an edge and have proven results on ES1 contract trades. Where my issue is when I increase my size to 3 to 5 contracts, I get fear of losing and wiping out. I cannot seem to get my mind around letting the method play out and end up with scratch trades. Please address issues, if possible, in future webinars. Well, hopefully you're here in this webinar because you're in luck. So, I mean, there's so many places to go with, with this. The one good thing is that you're starting new. You haven't created any bad habits yet, so it's not going to be as difficult to overcome some of those really, really bad experiences that other traders have. I'm saying it's not impossible, but it does take some work. So, what I would recommend here is understanding, where you have limiting beliefs. It sounds like there, could be some limiting beliefs, that are there with regards to, the fear of losing and wiping out. Again, without talking to you a little bit further, I can't necessarily identify that, but figuring out where those limiting beliefs are, creating enough emotional leverage for you to do whatever is necessary to kind of get to that next level, because from where you are now, it will take you some time to get to that next level. But the good thing is you'll learn very, very quickly. All right. So once you can identify what your limiting beliefs are, and we do this in Module 1, that we actually dedicate an entire module in the trading psychology course for this, how to destroy limiting beliefs. Then the second one is creating emotional leverage. That's Module 2. And the reason why that's important is because, like I said from the very beginning, this work is very, very difficult. So you really need to be able to emotionally connect with what's most important to you and why you're doing this, because you will have those really, really bad days, right? Whether it's trading, whether it's an obstacle or challenge, whatever it is, they're inevitably going to come up. So you need to have enough reasons, enough fuel, and enough whys to continue pushing forward. And that for me was what drove me to continuously figure out what was going on in my head. So the way I started trading, I would just buy system after system after system, because it was in my head that the more I learned, the more systems I could kind of lay on top of each other, the better it would be. But then eventually it got to the point where I was just so confused. It looked like a 3-year-old had just drawn a bunch of stuff on my computer screen. I mean, there were so many lines. I mean, I had no idea what the hell was going on. So then I realized at that point, it's not knowing more. It's about identifying what was the consistent item, or what was the consistency throughout all of the different systems. And then my aha moment was I realized that was me, and that's when I really started digging in deeper and looking internally and accepting responsibility and accountability for the results that were occurring on my P&L. And that's really when my trading really started just getting significantly better. When I was able to identify, just clear up all the stuff, just start focusing on a few trades, and then just trying to execute those to perfection. That's when my trading got significantly better. So anything to add there, Peter? I'll take that as a no. Okay. Move on to the next one. Where'd it go? Okay. All right. I've been a follower of yours for over 6 years now. Psychology is what I recognize as the most difficult skill to master. one that I still struggle with. I purchased the Trading Psychology series a few minutes ago. Well, thank you. Appreciate that. I began reading through the materials and to my satisfaction quickly realized this is much further in depth than I had originally expected. I can already tell this is going to be worth beyond the asking price of the series, so thank you. Well, thank you. We try to deliver. We try to give you guys 10x, whatever we ask of. So, we're really glad that you're getting a lot of value from this. So one topic which may be discussed in the series, that I've recognized with my own trading is recovering from bad habits created by poor past practice. I've been recently adjusting my trading style after I found success, what I thought was consistent, then ultimately failure. After adopting a new style and finding some success, I quickly realized I'm not allowing the max potential of some trades, mostly driven by fear of losing and taking another devastating trade. All right. So again, what I take from this is again that fear of having another devastating trade. One of the things that I talk about in Module 6, it's called 60 to Strength, summoning the best version of you every single day. And I worked with Peter on this. When we were working together and creating a routine for you to be the best of whatever you can, and again, creating that routine every single day so you can actually bring that best version of yourself to your trading. It's really difficult because sometimes, if you sleep incorrectly, if your spouse looks at you the wrong way, if your kids aren't acting perfectly, all those things in life can really affect and can seep into your trading. So how do you actually create a routine where you can eliminate all the noise and not allow that to creep into your trading? So one of the things that we talk about is overcoming trading losses. And for those of you that have bought the course, there's some pretty funny things in there. Some part of the video you'll see Peter doing. It's pretty hilarious. We got a kick out of that part. And it's about not taking that negative charge from the last trade and not allowing it to negatively impact the next trade that you're going to take, right? Because I'm sure there's times when you've had a trade, that you lost in, right? And then you try to revenge trade, and then it just becomes another losing trade, and then you try to make more money back, and then you start losing, and then you cascade down into basically a black hole, and then all of a sudden you had a really, really bad day, right? And then after that, if you don't take control of that, or if you don't eliminate the negative charge, then you take that bad trading experience into the next day, right? And then what became one bad trade cascades into several bad days, several bad weeks, or you actually blowing up your account, okay? And then also another thing that we can talk about is anchoring, which is ways to get you out of a state of anxiety or a state of fear. And one of the things that we provide for you, as part of the course is a tuning fork, and I show you how to actually anchor positive states, positive emotional states that'll drown out those negative states, when you're trading. And then, lastly, having a trading journal, right? If you have those, if you can document your trades, if you can document what you were thinking, and really understand the intent behind why you do something. And again, you have to understand the difference between what your intent was and what your results are, because sometimes your intent can be right and you still lose, and other times your intent can be wrong and you still win. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you're in a trade, and let's say it's your price is hovering around your entry point, right? And then all of a sudden it just pops up a few ticks, and then you exit even before that happens. So technically you got out because your intent was because you were fearful, right? But the result was still good because you still had a winning trade, right? So that's not what we want. So what we want to do is we want to understand our intent of why we do things, because once our intent is good, right, and we're operating at the correct levels, then we don't have to worry about the results, because the results will come. right, so let's take a look at
Ben,
yes.
can I just speak to that for 1 second?
Sure.
I just want, something just came to mind that's important, and I think this will help people that are watching this, is that when Ben is going through the case studies, like for instance, that one was specific about. I felt like when you were reading it, that the individual was kind of asking you, like, how can I stop doing this? Like, what's the magic bullet? Can you tell me, like, I get scared if I go to 3 to 5 contracts and whatever, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same thing over and over. And so obviously Ben and I, just to be really frank with you guys, I mean, yeah, we put together this course, and we'd like as many people as possible to experience it. But what I want everybody to know is that one of the reasons beyond just the very obvious that we keep referencing it is the fact that what the person is asking is not really possible in the way they're asking it. What I mean by that is that there is no magic bullet that stops you from doing these wrong things. What the solution is that through doing the exercises in the course and going through all the materials and basically the exercises, like Ben mentioned, the tuning fork and bringing the best version of yourself every day, and on and on and on. I mean, it's extremely comprehensive. In doing all those things, you literally become a completely different person. But let's just keep it to trading. You become a completely different trader. So that's how, when you grow in that sense, you stop taking the 2-tick game, because you're a completely different trader because you've done all these things. But it's not like you could, like, say, okay, Ben, I want to hire you. Tell me how to stop doing this. Okay, so Ben would say, okay, so when you take the trade and you think you're going to get out for 2 ticks, do this instead. It's not like that. It's the fact that it attacks your problem at the root. And that's why it's so valuable. Like you often hear people argue about, like, I don't want to take drugs because it's just, fighting the symptoms, but I have real problems. I need to fix it at the core. Well, they're exactly right. That's it. Some things fix it at the core so it doesn't come back again, and so you can build on it and have greater success, and some things just, alleviate symptoms. So I just want to throw that in. It's just really important for people to understand that I don't want people just to think, oh, we're just here, we just keep leading you back to the course because we're just here selling you something. The truth of the matter is that that's the only solution, really, is to investigate methods that change you from the beginning and change the type of trader you are. Because, and I mean, I'd like your opinion on this, Ben, but to me, and this is from experience, there is no real magic bullet. Like, there is no, like, thing where you're like, okay, I'm gonna, when I get into the trade, I'm gonna, somehow I'm gonna break myself of this habit. Like, you can do that. You can certainly go cold turkey and just, like, force yourself into it, and then in doing so, you become a different trader. But think about that. That's not going to happen in one trade. That literally takes the next 50 to 100 trades in order for that to become ingrained in you as a new type of action, to become natural, just like learning anything in your life, right? I mean, would you agree, Ben?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even if I give you the magic bullet for one issue, it's only going to possibly cover up that issue for a short amount of time, because what will happen is your mind will figure out another way to cause that issue, because you haven't taken the actual root problem out. So it's basically symptomology, right? If I help you with the symptom, it doesn't cause the root, and you're still going to see it manifest in your body in a different way.
Exactly.
So, we've created the course to be extremely comprehensive, and I'm not lying that it took 3 years to put this together. And Peter's decades of experience, my decade of experience, we took everything from from all of our experiences to really create something that's a complete holistic approach that helps you to shore up all of those challenges that you have, because really trading is one of the most difficult ventures or journeys that you can ever go on, because you're only as good as your last trade, more or less, right? So if you're not able to overcome those trading losses, right? If you're not able to bring the best version of yourself every single day, if you don't understand what drives your trades, what nuances really support your trade, if you're not able to eliminate your limiting beliefs, if you're not able to create the emotional leverage to get yourself to do whatever is necessary to to move to the next level, I can give you one piece, but it's not going to help the whole problem, right? So that's why we've created this, so it can help you to really become that trader that can consistently take money out of the market every single day you trade. All right, so let's see here. So we have two more case studies. Let's go through these relatively quickly. So, hi, my number one issue is that I traded futures before knowing enough about risk management. Well, that's a big point, right there, having a risk management system. I was following a method promoted in a trading room which used cost averaging if the trade went against your initial position. I lost over 6,000 in 1 hour. I've taken a long break, paper trading, and learning other better risk management systems. My main problem is that I don't give trades enough time. I take profits way too early, preferring a small gain over what might be a loss. This is a hard psychological habit to break due to the early trauma of losing so much money so quickly. I guess I don't trust myself to take reasonable losses rather than to add to losing trades, even though I know I have to learn to take reasonably small losses or else I shouldn't trade futures. Okay, so again, there's a lot of different issues there, I guess you can say, are challenges that need to be overcome. I'm glad you at least understand that you need to have a risk management system. It's kind of like knowing when to double down or to bet really big when all of your stars align, right? If there's a trade that you see or a setup where, okay, you have, let's say, 5 out of 7 of your criteria, right? So why would you bet big on that one? That's one trade you may actually want to limit to 1 contract instead of betting 10 contracts. But let's say you have one setup that happens once in a blue moon, right? But you'll make 50 or 60 points on the ES. So that's when you want to obviously stay within your comfort level, but you still want to bet bigger on those. So that's something that you can do with your risk management system. And then another thing I want to talk about is I love how none of the trading educators out there will ever tell you you need trading psychology, right? They always say, if you buy my system, you'll be a millionaire. That's pretty much it. Buy my system, you become a millionaire. There's nothing in between. So that's why I love working with Peter, because he tells it like it is, and they will show you exactly all of the ugly and the pretty and everything else in between of trading, right? Because it's not just sunshine and flowers. There's a lot of hard work and tears and sweat that go into this. Any comments there, Peter? If not, I can go on to the next.
No, here is all I can say. You're exactly right. My only comment is I wish I could crawl through the screen to strangle the person who had this client average their risk higher and higher and make them lose $6,000 a day. That is a type of chat room that should be illegal in my view and should be shut down immediately. And I'm going to stop talking right now because I literally get that angry when I read stuff like this.
And I will speak to fear, because here's one thing that I experienced. I remember trading. It was the day before TARP was announced. Actually, it was the day that TARP was announced. And again, this was earlier in my trading career, and I got into the trade. I went long, and I was using Trader Workstation through Interactive Brokers at the time. I didn't have automatic trade management systems, so I would have to manually input my stop loss, my targets, and whatnot. Well, the market moved very quickly up. I couldn't exit my trade, and then the market just tanked. I forget how much it tanked, probably at least 100 points on the ES. And the only reason why I got out was because of a margin call, from my broker, from IB. And if you want to talk about fear, I felt it at that time. I was just so frozen. I just couldn't do anything, and I lost. I forget how much of my account. I had a $50,000 account. I think I lost like 40 of it in a day. I forget how much it was. So I definitely understand how it feels to be completely stricken with fear and not be, even able to get out. So that's why, understanding what fear is, what anxiety is, and taking all the necessary steps and utilizing the tools and strategies that we provide you, in this course is so important. Because, again, I've done it before in my life. I hope you guys never have to experience that. So, that's why we've created something where we hope that you can use the things in the all the stuff that we share with you here, so you never have to lose 80% of your account in a day. All right, so last one. Okay, so my biggest problem is fear of losing money, which of course then leads to taking myself out of taking good trade setups. I know a lot of the problem is that a couple of years back, my wife and I were learning how to trade options with this options guru, and ended up losing several thousand. So I stopped trading, and then I got into futures trading, which I love, but this fear keeps on popping up. So again, it's a lot of the same challenges that we all have. Really, the fear. How do we overcome that fear? How do we overcome the fear of missing out? How do we overcome those really bad days, right? So again, we're kind of short on time here. But all this is actually in the course, and it's really reasonable. We priced it so that everyone can afford it, and then we've actually even given you guys a promo code to to save $100. So if you use the code MENTAL, you'll save $100, which is 20% off, and $390, $395 is not that much money to invest in yourself. Just imagine, what will happen if you just spend $400 and really commit yourself to doing the exercises, learning from it, learning from Peter's and my experience, so that you can become the trader that you deserve to be. Because that 90% of future traders lose money, right? So how do you become the 10%? It's really from doing work like this. Okay, so if you have any questions, let me know. What you can do is go to the Shadow Trader website. It's on the Premium Services page right here under Trading Psychology, and you can use the code MENTAL for a $100 discount. So if you guys have any questions, I think we have like 4 minutes there, Peter.
Yeah, Ben. If there's any questions specifically, you can put it into the chat. And
okay, nice. Okay, so here's a question. Ben, didn't you use a stop loss when you took that huge loss trade? Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, I was using Interactive Brokers Trader Workstation, and you need to manually input your entry, your exit, your stop loss, and all the different targets. So unfortunately, I couldn't get it in time because they had announced it, and again, I didn't realize that news was being announced at the time, and yeah, I just got killed on that one. But it was an incredible lesson. I mean, I didn't trade for a while because it hurt so much, but
yeah,
I got over it.
I just want to point out this gentleman, Jacob. I just remember his name. He wrote that he's halfway through the series and he highly recommends it. So that's really cool, Jacob. We appreciate that. We're glad you're enjoying it. And it gets better towards the end. I think the last couple modules are really cool, so.
Peter, how long is the code good for?
It's going to be for a while. I didn't put any sort of expiration on it. Obviously, I knew we had like 3 webinars to go. So, we'll obviously let it run through the webinars, and then maybe we'll make a decision after that as to what we'll do about it.
Okay. Great. What do I trade? I traded the ES futures in options. That's what I used to trade. I used to trade a lot more than that. Then I realized, I wanted to master something first, and the ES was what I did really well. So instead of trying to trade a million different things, like some of us try to do in the very beginning, because again, it's that fear of missing out. So that's what worked for me. Let's see here. All right, so how do you stop second guessing your entry and exit even if you have a specific target? And again, we talk about that in the trading criteria. It's about understanding the reasons why you want to you want to enter and exit a trade, and what Peter talks about as trade good. Good trade location, and extrapolating that to a very granular degree, because he can speak to something and he understands things very, very well, right? If you don't understand it as well as he does, then you understand that you have a lot of work you need to do to get to that particular point. Because, again, we've gotten to the point where, we're able to trade. We're at stage 4, basically. We're unconsciously competent, and we can see things. We've seen enough price action to start seeing things, and to either enter the market or exit the market. So it's just about learning and figuring out what holes you have in your understanding about your trades. Because once you get to that point, you can say, all right, well, I don't understand why this is, and you can start asking questions. Does that make sense?
Exactly. I just want to also mention, Ben, for the question that you just answered is, a lot of what it comes down to is, as you evolve as a trader, you will start to understand what is truly signal and what is noise, and you will not second guess yourself as much. But a lot of it also does come from that whole, writing out of the process, which is something that we talk about a lot. And as I was saying before, is through my work with Ben personally, because I'll tell you guys, before we did the course, right, how this all came about is I met Ben at Dalton's. Ben and I met in Chicago at Dalton's, one of Dalton's seminars. He used to do these things out in Chicago like 4 days straight. It would be like Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, like 2 days of theory, and then live markets like Monday, Tuesday. And I met Ben. I was very impressed. And Jim Dalton allowed Ben to have like 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the webinar to present some stuff on trading psychology, and I thought it was solid. I took the handouts and whatever, and then we kept in touch, and then there were some things that I wanted to work on, and so I hired Ben basically, and I retained him for a couple of months, and I enjoyed it. It was phenomenal. It was, I'll be honest with you, it was a lot more expensive than the course, but it was worth it. It was fun, but I'm just, and the only reason I say that is just because that's how it is with like any of these guys. Like, I mean, it doesn't matter if you're working on, trying to deal with some personal issues or whatever, nobody's going to, let you dump all that, what on them for nothing, So anyway, but it was cool. So anyway, so we worked together for a couple of months, and I found it really helpful. And then that's how the idea for the whole course got. I said, you know what, let's build something together, because a lot of these things that you taught me are really, really cool, and I haven't seen them anywhere else. I've never read about them in any books. They're unique. And why aren't there any trading psychology, video series or something out there, right? I mean, there's a number of books and whatnot, but there's no real interactive, I wanted people to do some of the exercises that he made me do, which I thought were really cool. So I was like, okay, let's, maybe we should put this together in a series. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that little anecdote, that's how this whole thing came together. And as Ben was saying, it did take a number of years. I mean, a lot of that is due to, obviously, we're both extremely busy. They're scheduling things, I'm in the Philadelphia area, Ben's in the Palm Beach area, so it was back and forth. And, we both made a couple of plane trips back and forth, and a lot of, the editing, of course, is a monstrous task. I mean, you're talking about, the whole thing is like 7.5 hours long, but in order to get 7.5 good hours, you have to start with 60 hours of footage, really, and then you whittle that down to what's decent. So anyway, that was that. So I just wanted to mention that. But to answer that question, a lot of it is that whole writing out of the process, I think, gives you a lot more confidence, so that then when you do enter, you can distinguish what is signal and what is noise, and just ignore noise and concentrate on that trading signal and be like, okay, the market's just trying to fool me out of this. Remember, that's the market's job. I mean, the market basically moves and it goes from A to B. And there is no them, there is no they, and there certainly isn't any like invisible hand that is the market that's trying to screw you. But all of that being said, it's just the natural order of things of how the market works, that all of the price over time is going to kind of distribute in the middle. And when the move gets going, the job of the market is to get going as quickly as possible and get from A to B with as few people on board as you know, as it can. You know, the boat is never really full at the beginning when you should be entering. The train is empty, but that's the best time to get on. But it's the market's job, so to speak, to scare you so much and make you believe that it's not a good time to get on the bus, you know, to make you believe that the bus is just going to crash right through the station and keep going. But, you know, of course, the market's just lying to you. I mean, there's, you know, that's why, you know, that's when it gets into market internals, market profile, cumulative tick, you know, all this, the tools that I use to know, to understand the language that the market's speaking and, you know, really know what it's saying.
Awesome. All right, should we wrap up, Peter?
I think so. I think that's it. Ben, I want to thank you so much. That was our first webinar, and how to stop your mind from stealing from you. The next one, Ben, I believe, is it Monday or Wednesday? I think it's Wednesday, right?
I believe it's Wednesday, yes.
I believe it's Wednesday, yes. So we are getting together again on March 22nd, which is a Wednesday, for the second Trading Psychology webinar. Shadowchair.net, click on the tab that says webinars and you can register there. And also I've been recording this and I will be rendering it and posting it to that same page within like an hour from now. And also you'll get an email from GoToWebinar automatically, whether you were here or not, that will send you a link to that. So it's all good. All right. Have a wonderful evening. Ben, thank you again. And hopefully we'll see you all again next week, Wednesday, for Trading Psychology webinar number 2.
Thanks everyone for